I wonder how many of you keep a dog as a pet or a working companion, particularly like if you're the one in the household that is sort of the main one in charge of the dog. And I wonder how your dog is and how well behaved they are and how happy they are. And I can hear a few chuckles. And but anyway, if you if you've got Sky Television, you probably got was it Geographic Wild, is it? And on there is Cesar Millan, the dog whisperer. He's in California, but he's been recognized as the dog whisperer for many years now, and he's currently got this program called Better Human, Better Dog. And I think that gives us a clue of where we might be going wrong with our pooch, but also, of course, with our fellow man. And one of the things that comes up time and time again is that the dog is causing some sort of problem. It's either aggressive or just too lively or just doesn't get on with other dogs. Whatever the problem is, it usually comes down to the fact that the person in charge of it isn't really in control of the dog. And that doesn't mean to say that you control it with an iron fist, but it's just to let the dog know that you are confident and that you don't need the dog to protect you. The dog is under your protection. And one of the mantras that Caesar uses is he calls this the pack code. It's not the pack code that you get on your phone, but it's the pack of the dog's code: honesty, integrity, and loyalty. And those three things, he said, if you've got those three things, you've just about got everything. And if you've got those things with your dog, they know that you are in control and that you can stand in the way of danger for them so that they don't have to protect you. But also for our relationships with family and everybody that we meet, if we practice those things, honesty, integrity, and loyalty, and then, if we seek to serve others and to do right by everyone, that's going a long way towards what Jesus wants us to do. So next time you see your dog causing trouble, just look at yourself in the mirror and say, what am I doing wrong? In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. We're going to have our first reading now, which is Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. And this is Peter's words. In thee, O Lord, do I put my trust. But we see what happens when his trust is challenged.
Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and, beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Amen.
Second reading comes from Genesis chapter 37. Joseph's dreams. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When the brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Moving on to verse 12 in the same chapter, Joseph sold by his brothers. Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, "As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them." "Very well," he replied. So he said to him, "Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring back word to me." Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering in the field and asked him, "What are you looking for?" He replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "They've moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him from a distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come on, let's kill him. Throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed blood. Throw him into this cistern in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe that he was wearing, and took him and threw him into a cistern. Now the cistern was empty, there was no water in it. As they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." So his brothers agreed. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern.
I tell you what, Mike asked me earlier if I want the lectern or this, whatever you call it. But the practicalities of, probably a pulpit are so much to be desired by preachers, because most of my stuff's on the floor now, whereas I could have it up here and I could flick from one thing to another, but I don't think that's recognized generally. Anyway, that's just another little challenge of life. It's interesting how life changes us. The things that we go through make a difference to the way that we face the future. We can find ourselves doing things differently and feeling like a different person than the one we remember that we used to be. Are we pleased or disappointed, proud or ashamed of the person that we have become? More importantly, how does God view us? Joseph, and when I think about Joseph, I think about my wife. She loved going to the plays that used to be put on about Joseph, and they used to do that Coach Green primarily. She used to just love seeing that, the singing and the story. And if you care to look, our reading today was from Genesis 37, but if you do the following chapters, you read the full story about Joseph. Joseph could have gone either way following the experiences of his youth. He was growing up as a favored son of his father Jacob, who gave him this special coat that we all talk about, the coat of many colors. His brothers didn't get a smart coat like the one that Joseph had. He irritated his brothers. He showed off in front of them. He even dreamed that he would grow up to be greater than any of them, and that they would bow down in worship to him. And he didn't keep that dream to himself, but told it to his family, who became even more furious with him. So when Jacob sent his favorite son out to find his brothers, who were miles away looking after their sheep, the brothers saw it as an opportunity to get even with this little upstart. And it occurred to me, how come the other 11 brothers were out looking after the sheep and Joseph was home with Dad? You know, he wasn't really pulling his weight. As they saw Joseph approaching, they plotted to kill him and make it look like a wild animal had savaged him. But one of the brothers, Reuben, was uncomfortable about that, and he tried to persuade them not to murder him, but to throw him in a pit where he couldn't get out, as he planned to rescue him later. When they'd taken off his fancy coat and thrown him into a dry water tank in the ground, they sat down to eat. Must have been a rather funny feeling, wouldn't it, if you just throw your brother in a pit in the ground and then sit down to have your lunch. Anyway, while they were eating, along came some Ishmaelite traders with their camels and their pack horses. And so they thought this will solve the problem of what to do with their annoying little brother. We'll sell him as a slave. Then he will be out of the way, and we won't have to feel the guilt of murdering him. So Joseph was taken down to Egypt by the Ishmaelites, and he was sold on as a slave to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials. How would you respond if that happened to you? Well, Joseph seemed to adapt well to the changes forced upon him and worked hard to please those above him. But still other people tried to manipulate his life, and he found himself in prison. He became known as one who could interpret dreams. And so when Pharaoh had a dream and needed an interpretation, the cupbearer to Pharaoh remembered Joseph, who had told him the meaning of his dream in prison 2 years before. Joseph was brought up from the prison and tidied up before being brought to Pharaoh, who said to Joseph, "I've had a dream. but no one can interpret it for me. And I hear that you can interpret dreams." Joseph said, "I cannot do it, but God will give the answer that Pharaoh desires." So Pharaoh related his 2 dreams to Joseph. And you'll be familiar when I tell you it was about the 7 fat cows and the 7 thin cows, the 7 plump ears of corn and the 7 scorched ears of corn. Joseph said that the 2 dreams mean the same thing. 7 years of abundant crops and 7 years of drought. The fact that there were 2 dreams means that it will definitely happen, and soon. Joseph said to Pharaoh, "You need someone to manage this period of plenty in preparation for the time of famine." And Pharaoh said, "There's no one more suitable than you." And he gave him full authority over all of Egypt. Imagine that, a Hebrew, just an ordinary man, a slave, and he was being put in charge of all of Egypt's affairs. 7 years of plenty went by, and Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain in each of the cities, so that when the drought kicked in, the people would be able to come and buy grain. 2 years into the drought, Jacob sent Joseph's brothers down to Egypt to buy grain because they were already suffering. Joseph recognized his brothers when they turned up, but they didn't recognize him. And I was trying to make some calculations of how long it was since they had met each other. Well, there was a 7 years of plenty, and there was a 7 years of famine. He was in prison for 2 years since the cupbearer got out. He was probably in there for a year or 2 before that. So, we're getting on about 20 years, just my rough calculation, since they'd seen each other. But anyway, the brothers came down to buy grain. So Joseph recognized them, but they didn't recognize him. He wanted to find out if they had changed over the years. Did they regret what they had done to him? Would they be prepared to do the same to his youngest brother Benjamin in order to save their own skin? What was their relationship with their father Jacob after they deprived him of his favorite son? And so he set up a series of tests so that they would have to come back a second time to buy grain. And during these tests, they were made to feel very vulnerable to this very powerful person in charge of Egypt's food supply. When they proved their humility and intention to do what was right, even if it meant personal suffering to themselves, Joseph couldn't keep up the act any longer. He made all his attendants leave his presence so that he was alone with his brothers. But he wept so loudly that the people outside the room could hear him. And then he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt." They couldn't believe it. After explaining God's plan to provide for his chosen people, Joseph embraced his brother Benjamin. He kissed each of his brothers and wept over them. In the words of Paul, Joseph boasted of God's deliverance. He felt no hatred towards his brothers because even through the darkest and saddest parts of his life, he relied on God. And he honored God by giving him the credit or the glory when he himself was honored. That begs the question, in what ways may we bring glory to God. God had been faithful to the promises that he had made to Jacob and those before him. His desire was that this family would not only survive but prosper, even though at times it seemed like the end of the road. I like those programs about people's life and history, particularly Who Do You Think You Are? And I know they probably pick the most interesting ones, but there always seems to be periods of great challenge to each family. Some turn up nice things from the past, but often it's tragedy and suffering that they find. These stories are reflected in the families that we read about in the Bible and even in our own families. Each family has its troubles, but for each individual, there is a choice to be made. Joseph brought trouble upon himself by his attitude of proudness in his younger days. And although that doesn't excuse what his brothers did to him, but when he found himself in Egypt, he decided to work hard and follow the faith of his father. He grew to know God for himself. He learned to trust him and honor him. Joseph changed from a loved son and despised brother, a selfish and rather spoilt child, to a wise and powerful man, because he gave himself fully into God's hands and allowed himself to be molded and changed and used to glorify God and fulfill his purpose. Do we yield ourselves to God? In times of adversity, do we turn to God and try to bring him glory and pray that the outcome will be to the glory of God? Joseph's brothers, that day they sold him off to the Ishmaelite traders, never expected to see him again. They had probably spent many sleepless nights of regret and no doubt said prayers asking for God's forgiveness for their hasty actions. They had changed over the years as well as Joseph. Their hearts had softened. They had learnt humility, and now they were only too pleased to bow down to their younger brother. He had proved himself worthy of that. But that was something that Joseph no longer desired. His life may have seemed pointless when he found himself as a slave in Egypt, but he lived his life as if it had purpose. He could never have known how God would honor him at every turn, and could never have imagined the blessing that God would pour out upon him. And so to conclude our thoughts, we see how Joseph allowed God to use him. He was in fact God's instrument of salvation for his family and the whole nation of Israel. We can be used by God to bring others into the saving grace of God. So when we look at our lives of how we once were and how we are now, do we live a life like Joseph? Amen.